On October 17, 1997, Sheriff Thomas Wilkins received an anonymous connection that it would forever change the quiet city of Oakage in the interior of Oregon. The complaint made by a neighbor who preferred not to identify himself alleged strange sounds from an isolated property belonging to the Blackwood family, established in that region, mountainous, since the mid-19th century. There is something wrong in that barn. I have never seen anyone come in or out, but at night sometimes I hear shouts. They are not animals, said the recording of the call preserved in the archives Lane County Police. What the authorities found on the Blackwood farm approximately 40 kilometers from Oakage Center exceeded any expectation. Hidden by a dense vegetation and surrounded by a barbed wire fence of almost 3 m of height, there was a faded red barn, apparently common at a distance, but sealed with several locks, chains, and padlocks at its only entrance. When the officers broke into the door, the odor was the first thing that hit them. A mixture of urine, feces, and something indefinable that one of the police would later describe how the smell of the very absence of humanity. Inside, partially illuminated by cracks on the roof, found 7 women, with ages ranging from 12 to 42 years, living in conditions that the police report has classified as incompatible with any standard of human dignity. I swoo. Dr. Michael Stevenson, a coroner who accompanied the operation, told the Portland Herald, "In 27 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like that." Those women had physical characteristics that immediately suggested severe consanguinity and prolonged facial malformations, extra fingers, obvious vision problems. But the more disturbing were the eyes. Everyone had exactly the same empty look. Subsequent investigations would reveal that the barn housed not only victims, but a generational experiment of family endogamy that extended for at least 5 generations. Genetic records collected at the University of Oregon would confirm those were possibly the most consanguineous women ever documented in modern United States. The property officially belonged to Jeremiah Blackwood, then 68, patriarch of a family that was progressively isolated from the community throughout decades. What started as a simple social removal would eventually be one of the most disturbing stories of abuse, isolation, and intentional genetic manipulation already documented. The initial investigation showed that 4 of the 7 women were biological daughters of Jeremiah, while the other 3 were the result of unions between their own children and daughters over the years. The coefficient of consanguinity of some of them, according to later calculated by geneticists at the University of Washington, reached values close to 0.375, numbers rarely seen outside extremely isolated communities. This was not a case of ignorance or accident, explained Dr. Eliza Montgomery, forensic geneticist in charge of the case. We found detailed diaries that demonstrate clearly a deliberate intention to create a pure lineage, as they called. There were notes on specific physical characteristics, attempts to select traits like eye color and bone structure through planned crossings between relatives nearby. The case of Blackwood not only shocked the small local community, but also rekindled discussions on rural isolation, community surveillance, and the limits of family privacy in remote regions of the United States. Blackwood family history goes back to Great Depression, when Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, acquired the 200-acre property in 1931 for a fraction of its value. Original Lane County records show that Elijah, a former Monroe who lost all in the economic collapse, paid only $175 for the land. Value that even in that epoch was considered extremely low. The reason for the price, according to local historical archives, the property had a sinister reputation. In 1924, former owner John Wickman had murdered his intense family before committing suicide. And since then, no one was interested in the earth. This event, although apparently disconnected from the history of the Blackwood, would establish an isolation and superstition pattern that would shape the family's fate. Elijah Blackwood arrived with his wife Martha and 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. According to the few school records preserved in the Municipal Library of Oakage, the children attended the local school for just a year before they were removed for home education. The official document of school dismissal, dated 1933, contains an observation of the director of the time. Family demonstrates behavior extreme, not inmate. Children exhibit proper knowledge for age but avoid contact with other students. The family rarely went to the city, making only 2 or 3 annual visits to buy that they could not produce. A diary maintained by the local warehouse owner between 1935–1940, preserved at the Oakage Historical Museum, records, "The Blackwood came today. As always, the children and Mrs. B stayed in the car while the old man made the shopping. No one smiles in that family. Bought unusual amounts of kerosene and ammunition. Something doesn't seem right with them." During World War II, when recruitment agents visited the property in 1943, found armed resistance. The police records of the time indicate that Elijah threatened the officers with a shotgun, stating that no Blackwood would spill blood through a government that only remembers men when need them to die. For some reason not fully clarified in the archives officers, the authorities decided not to insist. It was in this context of paranoia and isolation that Harold Blackwood, the middle of Elijah and Jeremiah's father. Documents found on the property during the 1997 investigation reveal that Harold married his own second cousin, Degree Rebecca, who lived in Idaho. The wedding was registered in 1952 at the Boise, but Rebecca was never seen by the Oakage community. Harold appeared one day with a wife, he recalled in testimony, Eleanor Wilson. Then at 93 years old, former local mail employee, "We never really saw her, right? It was in the car, always wearing a wide flap hat and veil, even in summer." The letters who came to her from Idaho stopped arriving after a couple of years. Medical records recovered from the property indicate that Rebecca gave birth to 6 children between 1953 and 1962, all at home, without professional medical assistance. Of these, only 3 survived beyond childhood. Jeremiah, born in 1956, Mary, 1958, and Joseph, 1961. The other 3 babies died of congenital complications, according to notes made by Harold in a notebook that worked as a family medical record improvised. A disturbing entrance to this notebook dated 1962 suggests the moment when the ideology of genetic isolation began to take more concrete form. "Rebecca is too weak for more children. But we don't need strangers. We have our own pure blood, strong like steel when kept without mixtures. The weak die so that the strong prosper. This is the law of nature that the men of the city forgot." When Harold died in 1978, victim of an accident with his tractor, Jeremiah, then at the age of 22, he took control of property and family. At that time, according to tax records, the family had expanded the main house and built 2 structures, additional on the property, one being the barn that would become the center of the horror discovered almost 2 decades later. The family's isolation intensified under Jeremiah's leadership. While your father still maintained minimal contact with the city for essential purchases, Jeremiah reduced these interactions practically zero. Agricultural supply store records show that the last purchase made by a Blackwood occurred in 1983 when Jeremiah acquired large amounts of seeds, tools, and construction materials sufficient to support a long period of complete isolation. The most disturbing, as revealed by the diaries seized in 1997, was the transition of a simple social isolation to a deliberate project of genetic purification. Jeremiah, who apparently developed a self-taught interest in genetics through books found on the property, began to systematically document characteristics, family, physical, and planning unions between relatives. "The outside world corrupts the blood," he wrote at an entrance of 1985. "Each generation that remains pure strengthens what we are. The weak will die, the strong will prosper. In 5 generations, we will have created something that the world has never seen." The Red Barn, built in 1980, according to records found on the property, was projected from the beginning not as an agricultural structure, but as a space of lockdown. Detailed hand-drawn plans by Jeremiah show a building 2 floors with internal partitions, rudimentary water system, and more disturbingly, an elaborate system of locks that could only be opened by the side from the outside. The 7 women rescued in 1997 lived in conditions that police reports described as medieval. The ground floor of the barn contained a central area common with a long wooden table, some rustic benches, and a wood stove that it provided minimal heating during the rigorous winters of Oregon. The second floor had been divided into small cubicles that futed as individual dormitories, each with a straw mattress and a bucket for physiological needs. There was no electricity. There was no proper plumbing, said the report of the social services. Water was supplied through a gutter system that collected water from rain in barrels. During periods of drought, Apparently Jeremiah, or his brother Joseph, brought water from a nearby well. The barn windows had been preached and covered with boards, allowing only the light entry through small cracks and some translucent tiles on the roof. This, according to the psychologists who evaluated the victims, was a calculated form of temporal disorientation. Women had only a vague notion of the passage of days depending on the natural light that could penetrate these limited openings. The case became even more disturbing when Sarah, the oldest of women rescued, then 42, he started talking to the investigators. Sarah, identified as Jeremiah's biological daughter with her own sister, Mary. She had been the first to be confined to the barn at the age of 15. Daddy said we were special, that our blood was purer than that of any family in America, said Sarah in a recorded statement now preserved in the archives FBI as part of its extreme case study program. Hyatt had horsepower books. How creators maintain pure strains. He said that we were doing the same thing, only better. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Purity does not justify the cruelty. According to the diaries and the testimony of Sarah, the system worked in a methodical family. Women as soon as they reached puberty were transferred to the barn. There they were visited regularly by Jeremiah or Joseph in a system of documented rotation in notebooks found in the main house. These visits resulted in frequent pregnancies, although many ended in miscarriages or stillborn. Weak babies did not survive, and this was considered natural, even desirable, explained the Dr. Robert Peterson, forensic psychiatrist designated for the case. The children of sex male who survived were eventually taken to the main house to be trained, while the girls remained in the barn with their mothers, perpetuating the cycle. The daily routine of women, as rebuilt by the investigators, consisted of mainly at work, sewing, preparing simple foods, cleaning the confined space, and cultivate a small garden surrounded adjacent to the barn, where they could pass brief, always watched periods. This garden, ironically, was the only source of beauty in its lives. Several flower species had been planted among vegetables, creating a surreal contrast with the darkness of its existence. Makeshift medical records kept by Jeremiah found during the research revealed a disturbing clinical coldness. Each woman had a chip detailing its physical characteristics, history of pregnancy, and more disturbingly its reproductive value classified on a scale of 1 to 10. Food provided to women was surprisingly nutritious, though monotonous. Mainly cultivated vegetables on property, eggs, milk, and occasionally meat. No, it was a typical case of nutritional deprivation, said nutritionist Elizabeth Dawson in your report. On the contrary, there was an almost obsessive concern with certain nutrients. We find home supplements based on herbs apparently formulated to strengthen blood as described in Jeremiah's notebooks. The issue of communication with the outside world was non-existent. Women did not have access to radios, newspapers, or any other source of information. Your knowledge were limited to what they learned from each other and the few books allowed in the barn. Mainly practical manuals on agriculture, home medicine, and disturbingly an altered Bible from which Jeremiah had removed several passages and added their own texts. One of the most unsettling discoveries were Emma's notebooks, the second most old of women, then 37 years old. Hidden under their mattress, they contained drawings detailed from what she imagined to be the outside world, based only on the stories told by older women and in the scarce images of the few books available. Their designs of modern cities resembled illustrations of the 19th century, revealing the profound informational isolation in which they lived. They developed their own communication system, explained Dr. Linda Morris, linguist who analyzed interactions between women after the rescue. It wasn't exactly a new language, but used common words with specific meanings that only they understood. For example, they called the sun the vigilante and had dozens of terms different to describe the sounds of the barn during storms. When asked about resistance or escape attempts, women showed a conditioned response of fear. "Where would we go?" asked Lily. So with 23 years during a therapy session, Daddy said that the outside world was full of radiation, that people were sick and deformed, said we were the only healthy people who left, and one day when safe we would leave and we would repopulate the earth. This apocalyptic mythology created by Jeremiah to justify the isolation had been elaborated over decades and incorporated real news elements that he distorts. References to Chernobyl's nuclear accident, the AIDS epidemic, and other events global that he presented as signs of the imminent collapse of civilization. When the 7 women were finally examined at the University Medical Center of Oregon, doctors extended the physical consequences of generations of endogamy. The medical report later published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics as an anonymous case study detailed a series of conditions rarely seen in such a concentration. The pattern of observed anomalies suggests a severe consanguinity and sustained by multiple generations, wrote Dr. James Richardson, the main geneticist of the study. We are observing the expression of several rare recessive genes that normally they would remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Among the most evident conditions were polyactyly extra fingers in the hands or feet present in 5 of the 7 women, severe dental malformations including oligodontics, congenital absence of multiple teeth and microdontics abnormally teeth small. 4 of the women had heterochromy, a condition where each eye has a different color, a feature that Jeremiah apparently valued, and I was trying to select according to your diaries. More worrying were the internal conditions. Image exams revealed heart malformations in all women, ranging from septal defects light to more serious conditions such as tetralogy present in 2 of them. The most serious case was that of Rose, 19, said the medical report. She presented a combination of conditions that we would rarely see together in a single patient. Craniocytosis, premature fusion of skull bones resulting in severe deformity facial, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, and severe immunological deficiency that it made extremely vulnerable to infections. It is remarkable that it has survived this age without medical intervention. One of the younger women, April, then 14, had a rare disorder metabolic known as phenylketonuria, which had not been treated properly, resulting in irreversible neurological damage. The cognitive and psychological impact was equally deep. Neuropsychological tests revealed that 5 of the 7 women had some degree of intellectual disability, although it was difficult to determine how much of this was the result of genetic factors and how much it owed to the extreme educational and sensory deprivation. Sarah's case is particularly interesting, said Dr. Patricia Winters, neuropsychologist. Despite the conditions of extreme isolation, it demonstrates capacity above average cognitive. She learned to read alone, teaching herself through the few available books, and later taught the others. She developed a system time-counting complex based on light patterns that entered the cracks from the roof. DNA tests performed with state-of-the-art technology at the time confirmed what the physical symptoms already suggested. The endogamy coefficient of some of the most young people reached levels rarely seen in modern medical literature. In simple terms, the DNA of these women contains long identical segments in both chromosomes. Something that only occurs when the same genes are inherited from both parents who in turn share very close common ancestors. He explained Drivey Richardson in an interview with Scientific American in 1999. In populations, we see small segments like this reflecting a distant common ancestry. But in this case, up to 37% of the genome of some of the younger women consisted of these identical segments, numbers we would only find in extreme cases of population isolation. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the documentation found in the house main. In a locked office, the investigators found dozens of notebooks where Jeremiah had meticulously documented his observations throughout decades. These notebooks revealed that the patriarch was aware of the risks genetic but saw them as a necessary process of purification. The first generations will suffer so that future can transcend, he wrote in an entry dated 1992. The ancient Egyptians understood this. The pharaohs married with their sisters for divine reasons, not worldly. The weak are naturally eliminated. The strong survive and strengthen themselves. In another 10 generations, we will have created a upper lineage. This distortion of basic scientific knowledge to justify extreme abuse reflected a toxic combination of isolation, paranoia, and pathological narcissism. Jeremiah there was built an elaborate belief system that combined poorly interpreted elements genetics, decontextualized religious references and conspiracy theories on racial purity and genetic degeneration of modern society. Among the books found on the property were texts on eugenics from the beginning of the 20th century treated on animal breeding and surprisingly several books recent academics on population genetics suggesting that Jeremiah occasionally obtained updated materials possibly through requests for correspondence. He was not a man without education, said Dr. Peterson in his assessment Psychological. He demonstrated considerable intelligence but severely distorted by isolation, possible untreated mental illness and selective exposure to information that reinforced their pre-existing beliefs. It is a classic case of how knowledge without adequate social context or ethical supervision can be dangerously poorly applied. The morning of October 21, 1997 marked the beginning of a new life for the 7 Blackwood barn women. After 4 days of preliminary medical evaluations, they were transferred to an installation specializing in Portland, where a team multidisciplinary of doctors, psychologists, social workers, and special educators started that would be one of the most complex rehabilitation processes ever documented in the States United. The cool destination of Jeremiah and Joseph Blackwood followed his parallel course. Both were arrested on the day of the discovery of the barn and after extensive psychiatric evaluations were considered able to respond for the crimes. In September 1998, after a trial which lasted 3 weeks and attracted national attention, Jeremiah was sentenced to 6 feathers consecutive perpetual imprisonment with no possibility of conditional freedom by multiple accusations of kidnapping, rape, incest, and child abuse. Joseph, what the promoters argued that they acted under the psychological coercion of their older brother, received a 45-year-old sentence. This is not just a case of extreme abuse, said Judge Eleanina Hayes during the sentence. It is a case of deliberate and systematic perversion of fundamental principles of humanity, extending for decades and affecting multiple generations. The court rarely finds circumstances where the social reintegration of a defendant is considered fundamentally impossible, but this is one of these cases. Jeremiah remained impassive throughout the lawsuit, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the court. Its only statement made during the phase of sentence revealed the depth of your distorted conviction. You do not understand what destroyed. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was not cruelty. It was directed evolution. In 100 years, when their lineages are weak and sick, the world will regret that was lost here. Joseph, on the other hand, has progressively demonstrated signs of understanding of gravity of your acts. In a letter sent to the court before the sentence, he wrote, "I grew believing the world was, as Jeremiah said, I never knew another the reality. Not justifies what I did, but perhaps explain how a human being can become an accomplice. Something so horrible without fully recognizing your horror." For the 7 women, the process of reintegration would be long and complex. The program special developed for them by the University of Oregon, later known as Blackwood Protocol. It became a model for extreme cases of rescue of prolonged isolation victims. We couldn't simply launch them in the modern world, explained Dr. Catherine Morris, program coordinator. Everything from the constant noise of a city to basic concepts such as electricity, television, or internet. It was completely alien for them. We had to create a transition environment where they could be gradually exposed to aspects of modern life, always with intensive psychological support. The case gained a new dimension when in 2001 Sarah Blackwood, the oldest rescued women, published their memories with the help of Dr. Morris. The book Born in Darkness, Memories of the Blackwood Barn has become a bestseller instantaneous and was later adapted to a HBO award-winning documentary. Yields were placed in a fiduciary fund to support continuous treatment and education of all survivors. "We are not just victims," Sarah wrote in the epilogue of his book. "We are survivors and now finally we are people entitled to our own futures. The story of the barn is over, but our individual stories are just beginning." The impact of the Blackwood case extended far beyond the fate of people directly involved. In 2003, the United States Congress approved the SARA Law, establishing new protocols for monitoring children in home education in isolated rural areas. The law also created special funds for training professionals in rural communities to identify signs of extreme family abuse. In the scientific community, the anonymous medical data collected from Blackwood women, always with your informed consent, contributed significantly to the understanding the effects of severe consanguinity on humans. A longitudinal study still in progress at the University of Washington continues to monitor the aspects genetic, medical, and psychological of the case, generating dozens of scientific publications that helped improve treatments for various rare genetic conditions. In 2015, 18 years after the rescue, the Blackwood property was finally demolished after being acquired by the state of Oregon. Where the barn was before, it was established a small memorial, a simple bronze plate with the words to honor the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme cruelty. To remember that the isolation should never replace community surveillance. Of the 7 women rescued, 5 eventually managed to establish lives independent, although with varying degrees of need for continuous support. Rose and April, the most severely affected by genetic conditions, remained under care specialized. Sarah, the oldest, became an activist respected by the rights of victims of abuse and a symbol of resilience. In his speech at the National Conference on Child Abuse of 2010, she offered a powerful perspective. People often ask me how I survived those years in the barn. The truth is that I survived because I never knew that there was alternative. Now I know there was a whole world beyond those walls. My mission is to ensure that no child never grows without knowing that he is entitled to this world. The legacy of the Blackwood case remains a dark reminder of the extremes of the human isolation and the abuse that can occur when communities lose contact with its more isolated limbs. It also serves as a testimony of the extraordinary human capacity for recovery and adaptation even after experiments that challenge the limits of understanding. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying I watched here so I can meet you and know who really follows the channel. Do not forget to subscribe to know more real cases like this. Give your like to support our investigative work and share this impactful story with people who value documentaries that reveal the most obscure realities of human condition.